Welcome this evening to Teens, Tweens, and Screens. We are going to talk about compulsive tech gaming, social media use, and then from a parenting perspective, what you can do about it. We're going to start broad, talking a bit about mental health, about how all of these different factors weave into it, and then if you are concerned or if you have a young person in your life who's struggling with this, what you can do. Now, if you have questions as we go along this evening, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A. I'll be able to catch back up on the chat a little bit later at the end, but it might be hard for me to fish out questions. So there's actually a Q&A tab specifically down at the bottom where you're welcome to put those in, and if there are any at the end, I will answer them. Additionally, you are welcome to email me. My email is right here in the bottom left, aaron@weinerphd.com, and I am incredibly accessible. So if you have questions, you just don't think of it before we have to go, no worries at all. We can chat about it after the fact. So that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. And I actually want to start before we even get to talking about tech, gaming, social media. I want to just talk about why we do what we do. And this first slide might seem fairly obvious, but I think we oftentimes overlook it when we are looking at a behavior that we find concerning, which is that behavior is always purpose-driven, even if it doesn't seem to make sense. And what I mean by that is that if someone's doing something that seems counterproductive, like if you have a young person who's using social media and the more they use it, the less sleep they get, or the more they're in conflict with you, or the worse they feel about their body, but they continue to do it, that means that they're getting something from it that's incredibly powerful, that there's some sort of hook or it's meeting some sort of need for them. And understanding what that need is absolutely critical in order to empower yourself and your child to do something about it. So this is a theme that we'll come back to probably several times today. But that being said, the main reason why any person does a behavior that can be in many ways either habit forming or addictive is because of some sort of mental health or emotional problem that they're trying to solve. And right now we're unfortunately in a period, and here I'll take my head out of the way, but we're unfortunately in a period where mental health problems for kids is the worst it's pretty much ever been. This is data from the most recent Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And you can see that over time, feelings of clinical depression have been getting worse and worse and worse, to the point where 4 out of 10 teens said that they essentially experienced one of the primary symptoms of clinical depression in 2021, which is the last year that we have data. About 1 in 5 seriously considered attempting suicide or made a plan. 1 in 10 high school students actually said that they attempted suicide in 2021. Only a third of them, though, made it to a doctor or a nurse. But when I look at those numbers, when 1 in 5 kids is thinking about suicide and 1 in 10 is actually trying, that says to me we have to step up our game as adults, as caregivers. They need our help, and we might not even be seeing when they're suffering, and so we really have to be keyed in. And the COVID years unfortunately played a large role in why we are at this point, where even the physical shape of kids' brains now are different than they used to be. This is a study that came out that I know was very concerning to me, came out in late 2022, and found that if you look at a brain of, say, a 16-year-old before COVID versus now, right now, they have more internalizing mental health problems, which has to do with depression and anxiety, but also reduced cortical thickness, larger hippocampal and amygdala volume, and a more advanced brain age, and not necessarily in a good way. This is not the normal course of development. So it has literally changed the shape of their brain and the way that it's developing. And it's not just for them, it's for us as adults too. Everyone's been under so much stress. This was the Stress in America survey from 2022. And in that survey, 1 in 4 adults said that most days they're so stressed that they can't function. And the one from last year found similar results, that about a third of adults rated their average stress between an 8 and a 10, particularly between the ages of 18 and 44. 45 to 64 was down to about 1 in 5. But you can also see this very significant jump from 2019, which is black, to 2023, which is red. And so why this is all relevant is that unhealthy coping, whether or not we're talking about sinking into a fantasy world online or social media or even using substances, it comes from discomfort. If you think about mood being on a continuum from potentially very negative to very positive, and on the very negative end, you have things like fury or clinical depression, panic attacks, chronic anxiety. This is what drives these compensatory behaviors that we engage in because we don't like to feel this way. That's where the things like nervous tics, addictive behaviors, eating disorders, snapping, anger, rage, where it comes from, because we're sitting in this place of discomfort, and so we don't want to stay there, and we're looking for solutions. And the best way I can describe this, where when we're looking at why folks do what they do, and again, this goes for any age, although kids are particularly vulnerable, there's a fight essentially between two different parts of our brain, and I like to conceptualize this. This next slide is my most anatomically and functionally correct picture of the human brain that I can find, and it's of a dog driving a Tesla. And why I think this is a very apt metaphor for how the brain acts, particularly under stress, is that if we really just boil it down, and probably the two factors that matter the most, what we're looking at is a battle between our more logical thinking side and our more impulsive emotional side. The thinking side is the Tesla in this picture. It's very advanced. The actual name for it is our prefrontal cortex. It's the part of our brain where our executive functions are housed, the part that allows us to do things like think into the future and plan for taking care of large tasks, synthesizing big ideas, to think about short-term gain or long-term benefit, to moralize. All of those things are in the prefrontal cortex. However, as advanced as that part of our brain is, the Tesla part here, what is stronger is our more primal animalistic brain. Technical name for that is our limbic system, located a bit further back. That's this cute little guy, because dogs have that part too. And our limbic system is where our urges, our drives, and our impulses come from. And what we actually see in studies of the brain when you put someone into a stressful paradigm is the prefrontal cortex starts to shut down when we are getting very activated. We stop thinking as much and we start doing. And here's the thing about the limbic system, about the cute little guy behind the wheel of our car. That what the limbic system wants most, more than anything else, is not to feel distress, not to feel uncomfortable. It's like a survival mechanism, essentially. When we get distressed, we try to escape from that. And we usually think about that in short-term terms. Like we want to get out of it as quickly as we can. The second thing that our limbic system likes, other than not being uncomfortable, is to feel pleasure. And so that's sometimes where the technology can come in. It can do both of those things. It can take away pain, and it can provide some sense of pleasure. The problem is, of course, that it's not actually solving the problem. In the short term, maybe we're escaping or we're numbing out, but it's not actually getting us where we really need to go. And so the cycle then can continue and continue and continue, even again if it's not in your best interests. Now, what makes this even harder for kids is their prefrontal cortex, the more advanced logical part, isn't even done developing until about the age of 25. So they're not even playing with the same deck of cards. They don't have the same amount of resources available to them as we do as adults, which means it's very difficult then if, say, in their hand, they have a device that they can completely lose themselves in, where there's no end to the content, for example. It's very easy then for that to just completely carry them away and for them to have a hard time putting it down. Another way to think about this, there's a theory by Stuart Shanker that I really like. He calls it a self-reg model, where he talks about behavior being communication. So if you have a young person overusing tech, what are they trying to show us with that behavior? He calls it the tip of the iceberg, because whenever you have a young person doing an unexpected behavior or something that's clearly causing problems, there's actually a reason for that behavior that is informing it. And this isn't just for tech. This could be for acting aggressive or isolating in the room or snapping, anger issues, anxiety, depression. There's a reason for it. And he breaks it down into 5 different areas where there might be stress or unmet needs going on: biological needs, emotional, cognitive, so intellectual, social needs, and then pro-social needs, which are like what society expects of all of us. And so a way to think about this differently is when you see a young person overusing tech, instead of focusing just on the what, focus on the why as well. So yes, maybe they're having a hard time putting down their phone, or you're getting a lot of pushback, taking the iPad away at a certain point in time. That matters, but what also matters is why. Is there something going on? Is there some need that they're meeting where even though it's causing tension and stress, they keep coming back again and again and again? Now, unfortunately, this particular issue with tech has been growing over time. This is looking at total entertainment screen use from 2015 to 2021, and you can see these numbers go up and up to truly very shockingly large numbers, where teens right now say they spend over 8.5 hours every day with entertainment screen use. I mean, incredibly high on average. Tweens, about 5.5. And when you ask them, so what do you want to use the most? What are the services? It's YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, and TikTok right now are the most popular. And to put this in perspective in terms of how this is being used as comparison to, say, the old days of reading, reading is very much no longer in vogue. Again, I'll take my head out of the way. But very few kids right now, all things considered, are reading every day or even once a week, under half. And as you can see, there's plenty that are reading once a month, less than once a month, or just never reading anymore. And social media in particular, be it just in terms of entertainment screens, digging in a little bit further, is just incredibly rampant, which is why the Surgeon General asked for that warning label this morning. 95% of teens have access to a smartphone. 94% say they're online several times per day, and a little under half say they're online almost constantly. And this data in particular was one that the Surgeon General cited in his op-ed, that right now teenagers across all platforms say that they're averaging 4.8 hours per day on social media. And this is very concerning. We'll look at some data later that shows the breakpoint where we see the most emotional problems from social media use is actually at 3 hours a day, which is still quite a bit. But if the average teen right now is at 4.8, that is over that break point. Another piece of data that I know really spoke to me about how all of this is weaving together is that our attention span has decreased significantly over the past 20 years on average, where a study in 2004 found the average attention span at about 2.5 minutes. And now it's about 44 seconds. That's a 71% decrease over the past 20 years. And my personal opinion about this is that social media has a lot to do with it. Just a quick anecdote. The average TikTok user, this was from a Wired article that was published in 2022, opens their app 17 times per day to watch 85 minutes of videos. 17 times per day, going back over and over and over and over. And the most liked videos on that platform are about 30 seconds long. So when we think about the attenuation of attention spans, when we think about how short everything is, the quick bites, the social media posts, we're training our brains from a very young age to seek stimulation and to be distracted over and over and over and over again. Now, for those who are not as aware of what's being used, I'm just going to very quickly go through this. On the social media front, the big ones that we're hearing about right now are Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, and Discord. Snapchat is essentially a chatting app where a lot of kids think that the messages, they disappear, and they might disappear on the platform, but actually you can screenshot them. So a lot of times kids think that it's going to go away, but it doesn't. When you post something online, someone can take a picture of it. It can last forever. Instagram is another picture-based social media site. TikTok is all about videos, very short-form videos. And Discord is essentially a chat server in a way. It's a service that allows you to find communities of people to chat either with text or with your voice around certain areas of interest. It also, in Discord in particular, is very related to gaming, which is the other main area we're going to talk about today, which is very prevalent right now with kids. In fact, most young people are gaming and gaming very frequently. If we look over here at the United States in terms of the percentage who play games and then how many hours per week they are playing, The Gen Z, that's the one there on the far left, 96% of Gen Zers say that they play games, and that would be for an average of 11 hours per week. That's, again, a significant amount of time, and some do it a lot more. In terms of the popular games, they tend to shift around a little bit, but there are some trends that are very consistent, as well as some games that have stayed at the top for quite some time. Fortnite, for example, is basically a type of battle royale game where you're fighting against a bunch of folks to try to be the last person standing. Probably heard of that one. Roblox is a game that allows you to build essentially your own worlds or then be in other people's worlds. Same thing with Minecraft in a way. It's, we could describe each and every one of these in more depth, but essentially there's a lot that you could dive into. And no matter what you're looking for, you can probably find it. Now, some of the trends, though, that help hook the kids in is that many of these games are free to play. So you can download them and get started extremely easily. Take my head out of the way for a second here. But they're also pay to win. So you can get started very easily, but if you get invested and want to do very well, you then have to give money in order to keep up. Another way that these companies will make money is through paid customization. Like you can buy cosmetic items like hats or clothing, ways to customize your character, which, as we'll see in a minute, is very important to young people in particular. There's also social interaction and competition built into a lot of these things, as well as collaboration and discussion. So this is something where if you're feeling isolated or even if you have trouble socially, you can use these platforms in order to create that bridge and maybe even show off skills in a way that in the real world you don't feel quite as skilled. You can bring that into a virtual realm. Cosmetics, as I mentioned before, are also very popular right now as a form of self-expression for young people, as well as a revenue stream. And some kids are very interested in esports, which is also a real thing where you can join, be part of competitions and be competitive. It is very, very difficult, though, to make that to actually make it doing that, and it requires a tremendous amount of time. Now, where these two interact is through streaming, kind of the cross between social media and gaming. And so Twitch is probably the most common platform for this. And if you look at what people are watching, you'll see a lot of overlap between the list we were just looking at before. But with Twitch, and you can find this on Facebook, you can find this on YouTube, you're basically watching other ideally or usually good players play games. And so you're not playing it yourself, you're watching other people play it. It can be, of course, a form of entertainment, but it's also a way of building skill. If you're trying to get better, you can watch somebody who does it better than you. However, and this is the part again that really grabs people and brings them in, is that you're also joining a chat channel community with both other players and who are watching, as well as the streamers. So here's an example of what this looks like. I just grabbed this screenshot yesterday, I believe. And you can see that on this particular stream, here, I'll magnify it here, we've got 30,000 people watching. And this stream has been going actually for 91 hours. I'm not sure if he's actually been playing consistently for 91 hours. That would be a very long time to do it. It does say won't end until I beat Elden Ring, but hopefully this guy is sleeping. But you can see here on the right, there's a stream that, that when you've got 30,000 people, it can go pretty quickly. But particularly if folks are joining smaller communities, like this is clearly a streamer who's very popular if he's got 30,000 people watching him. But there are smaller communities of streamers who might have a consistent fan base where you get to know them, they will interact with you. You can also interact with the other people watching. But because there are so many people doing this, there's virtually no end to content. Even if you yourself don't want to play a game, or if you don't own a game, you can just hop on to any of these platforms, these streaming platforms, and watch somebody else do it and interact with them and chat, create a social experience. So to pull this all together, tech, games, and social media serve an emotional purpose for teens and tweens. And that's really core, again, to understanding what we do about it. And when you ask them what it does for them, we see some themes. Fun is one of them, social acceptance and connection, self-expression. Achievement is another one. If a child is struggling, say, in school, but if they can go into a virtual world and find more consistent success, that can be very, very alluring. But coping and escapism is really, if I had to pick one, the most important, and that's just not just my opinion. this graph is from a study that was asking kids what they get out of playing games in particular. And I should mention you will have access to all of these slides. I'll put them in the chat at the end of the day today. Additionally, I'll email them out, so you'll have them handy, so you can look back at this later. But this is looking at a bunch of different variables about why kids like to play games, and anything where the dot and the line coming out of the dot is far enough away from this vertical line that it doesn't touch means that it's significant. Like, this is something that kids really care a lot about. But if you look at the dots that are furthest away, each and every one of these here has to do with escapism and coping. And that really ultimately, when we talk particularly about folks who are developing a problem, is this core consistent theme. This is being used as a strategy in order to deal with feelings. So that one's really key. There's also this element, though, of self-expression, and this is something that matters more to kids and Gen Zers than older gamers. So if we look at this survey for personalizing my game character or avatar helps me to express myself, how much do they agree with that? You can see that Gen Z teens in blue, the light blue, and then Gen Z adults in the dark blue are higher than the average overall of gamers who endorse this. So 81%. The next one down, positive interactions with other players help me stay connected. So there's this very strong social and self-expression element to why young people are playing games. But now the last wrinkle that makes this so challenging is that games and social media are designed to be habit forming. And I know whenever I think about how best to represent this, this video just pops right into my mind.
Time to check my social media, yeah, to see who loves me online.
The point I was trying to make before we hit that glitch was that these are designed to be addictive, both games and social media. So, and it's worth mentioning that this is actually intentional in some ways, where it's being billed as something that's a good thing. So, like, we are now talking about how, like, games are addictive, which makes them good or better. Best TV shows to binge watch. This is honestly one of my pet peeves, is that we're using words like binge and addiction as if it's something to strive for, which in the world of behavioral health is something where actually, like, these are very destructive types of patterns. And it's worth mentioning that we are seeing, again, a lot of cross-pollination between gambling also and gaming, and even sometimes with social media. But there's a paradigm called loot boxes, which is being put into a lot of games that have these microtransactions where you have to pay money in order to get items. But you've already got, like, daily rewards. This is an example of one where just by logging in over and over and over again, it rewards you. So just like give it a little bit of positive reinforcement, right? Just a little bit of a nudge. But the loot boxes are really where the really, in my opinion, insidious part comes in. And these are very common in modern games. I think 50% is the current rate of games that are most popular with kids have this in there. And the way this works is that to get an item that you probably need to be either competitive or to continue in the game, you have to essentially pull a slot machine. You have no idea. Or if you remember those, like in the olden days in grocery stores, you put in a quarter, you turn and then out would pop some random toy. That's kind of how this works, except you need to get a very specific one oftentimes, or you want a specific one, and you have no way to know if you're going to get it. So here's an example. Hopefully this video also doesn't break my sound. I guess we'll find out. So if you can't hear me again, let me know. But what you're seeing here is, so you open the equivalent of a loot box. This is from a game called Genshin Impact. It's very popular right now. And you can see, there's all these things popping out. There's like bows and swords and a new character. And this is a 5-star one, and that's so exciting. And so then you get to, here's another one. And so it's flashy. Again, a lot of stimulation, a lot of colors. And totally random in terms of what you're actually going to get out of it. And then, after you get everything, maybe you got what you wanted, probably not, or maybe you just need more. So you go back in, you're going to literally see this person buy more and then do it again and again. And this is the equivalent of what the modern version of a slot machine is. And what's interesting is that kids are not allowed to gamble, right? We can talk a lot about sports betting and what's going on with that right now, about casinos, but essentially the bottom line of it is that you're not supposed to be able to gamble until you're 21. However, this is a form of gambling, and it's actually the way it's done is the way that you teach people, you train them. If, like, say you were training a rat or a pigeon in order to do a task over and over, it's using what's called a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. So very briefly, and you can see the slope of this line is really high, right? So this means that you learn the behavior really fast. The weakest way to train someone is just what's called a fixed interval. Every certain amount of time, you're going to get you're going to get a reward. Variable interval means you don't know when you're going to get it, but it has nothing to do with your behavior. You're just going to get a reward eventually. A fixed ratio means like every 3 times you pull a lever, you get something good. But variable ratio, which is the strongest one, is you never know if you're going to get something good. It can be 2 in a row, and then a gap, and then 2 more, and then space them out. And what we know, and this is how all gambling is formatted, including loot boxes, is that variable ratio is the one that gets people coming back the most. And that is quite literally what's being baked into these free-to-play games with these paid microtransactions that kids are allowed to do. So let's talk now about when it turns destructive. Because one of the points that the Surgeon General makes made it this morning in what he wrote, and that I definitely agree with, is that it's not everything is bad, right? There are certain things that are more harmful, but it has more to do with how it's used rather than what it is itself. So signs that any type of interactive media, so this could be games, this could be social media, anything that's interactive, is when we start seeing someone become preoccupied with it. So they're really zooming in, very singular focus, where they've got excessive time and potentially money spent on it. So it's really starting to dominate. If they're unable to prioritize or keep their schedules because they're spending so much time with it. If they are avoiding work and procrastinating, or for school because they just do it over and over and over again. If they're exhibiting anger or agitation when they have to stop or give up technology. If they're getting really irritable, bored, or sad when screens are removed, like they don't know what to do with themselves. If they are lying about screen-related behaviors or topics, or if they're using it to avoid their problems. Any of those could be signs that what's going on is starting to cross over from something that's just fun or being used for connection to something that might be causing some issues. And to boil all this down, though, because there's, again, a lot of things you could think about whenever I'm talking to anybody, and I'm an addiction psychologist, so there's themes that cut across a lot of these different either behaviors or substances. There's 4 things that I like to help people look for in their relationships to certain behaviors or substances. The first is, why are you doing it? What's the purpose? And in particular, is it to deal with your feelings? Because the moment that something stops being just for fun or take it or leave it or just something that you're doing socially and turns into, I need this to get through my day, or I need this in order to feel okay about myself, that's when you start feeling like you have to do it, and you have to do it every single day, and where the real danger starts to tick up in terms of health risk. The second is, how much are you doing it, and what are you doing? Is it something, say, that actually would be illegal to do? But that part aside, sometimes you can just look at how much someone is using their tech or their screens or a substance and say, wow, that is just objectively a lot. So that's the second thing. The third is, do they actually seem to have control over it? Like, if you were taking a break for a month, is this something that you could do? And I should mention, for some aspects of screens with kids, that's not necessarily the most viable, because a lot of kids' social lives exist on tech right now. And so it looks a little bit different now than it did before, but there might be certain elements. Can they give up? Can they cut back? Or does it seem like it always just slides back to wherever they were before? And then the fourth, and perhaps the most important behind the why, like, are you using this to cope, is consequences. And more specifically, are you continuing to use screens and tech and social media even though it's clearly causing problems in your life? And if that's the case, again, it means that whatever you're getting from it is incredibly important. is something you're just very attached to it. And this is, again, probably not the healthiest way to be meeting that particular need for yourself. So, what are the negative impacts of social media use in particular? And these, again, Surgeon General spoke to this in his op-ed this morning. It starts to displace other things, and that there's a mental health and even physical health impact on that. One of the biggest ones, actually, that to hone in on is the lack of sleep, because a lot of times kids are staying up very late with their devices, and it's directly taking out from their sleep. And actually, my next bullet is about that. The impact of insomnia is very significant on mental health and development. And so if you have a young person who's only sleeping for 4 or 5 hours a night, even 6, that has implications on how well they function at school, emotionally, so on and so forth. But it also can get in the way of things like in-person socialization, family meals, exercise, and so on. How social media is used also matters. For example, lurking, which means that you're looking at things online, but you're not participating. So you're on social media, but you're not being social. That is associated with lower well-being than for those who are participating. What we also know is that those who are engaging in more social comparison, that also leads to a decline in well-being. So if they're looking at influencers and starting to feel very negatively about their own bodies, for example, that's one that's been very well documented, or their life in comparison to the highly curated images that they're seeing, that is related to negativity. What we're also finding, though, is that high social status teens, they tend to actually have more positive experiences on social media. So if you are popular, if you're already successful socially, then you love being on social media, and it actually seems to be a net value. But if you are of lower social status, if you're on the outside looking in, if you're already feeling isolated, that tends to compound. This is kind of like a rich getting richer, poor getting poorer. And problematic social media use is associated with lower well-being, and at this point, literally hundreds of different studies. So this is not up for debate. Again, this is why the Surgeon General wrote his op-ed today, is that this is not something where there's mixed evidence. We know that when it becomes problematic, how we define that differs depending on the study, but we know that it's definitely harmful to mental health of teens. One way of thinking about it is this idea of excessive and impairing use. And we talked a bit about what that looks like on the last slide. Another way to look at it, though, is just about time. And I mentioned this study earlier on. This was another one that was cited by the Surgeon General this morning. I know I'm mentioning his op-ed a lot, but he did a very good job of synthesizing what I think are some of the most important points. And what they found here is we're looking here at those internalizing and externalizing problems. So internalizing problems, depression, anxiety. Externalizing problems have more to do like with acting out, being aggressive, that sort of thing. And you can see that as we spend more and more time on social media, as the kids do, it's going to the right of each of these different clusters of bars. You can see the lines, the percentage of mental health problems going up and up and up and up. And the point in particular that they were focusing on in the statistics is the 3-hour mark. So 6-hour mark is even higher, but the 3-hour mark tends to be particularly for internalizing problems as well as comorbid. So that means along with these the tech use, are there other problems that are going along with it? You can see that that's the point at which things start to get particularly negative. So other areas that too much tech can have a negative impact are cyberbullying, where kids these days, some show an endorsement rate of up to 75% having been cyberbullied at least once in their life, with females being more likely to have experienced this than males. Sexting frequency as well tends to happen more if someone is using more social media problematically. Contagion effects. So that means that if someone is watching content that has tics, eating disordered behaviors, substance use, self-harm, or suicidality, they are more likely than potentially to turn around and repeat that themselves. We're also seeing some impact of problematic social media use on suicide and self-harm behaviors, which is mixed, but is definitely correlated with increased use. So again, it's not a one-to-one, but particularly if there's someone having very problematic use, that can get them into trouble. And part of that is due to increased exposure to the content around suicide, normalization of the methods, as well as cyberbullying. Pivoting now over to gaming again, what does internet gaming disorder look like? Again, this is an official term. It got added back in 2019. Very similar symptoms: impaired control, increased priority given to gaming time, continuation despite consequences. It's resulting in distress or impairment. What we find is the kids who are most at risk are males, tend to have higher depression, anxiety, or stress, have ADHD, or either absent or authoritarian parenting. So parents who are either really not engaged very much at all, or who are very dictatorial, where there's not a lot of autonomy. So kind of on one side of the spectrum there or the other. The negative impact of internet gaming disorder. I will not read through this whole slide. It's here for your reference later. But a lot of similar problems, which is again why they're all in many times seen as just problematic interactive media use under this broad category of social media, of gaming, of browsing on the internet as well, scrolling, doom scrolling, that sort of thing, where you're just, this infinite scroll down through a social media app with lots of potentially negative influences, whether or not it's news or social comparison that's causing problems or so on. So we've talked a lot about the negatives. There are some positive sides to social media and gaming. So briefly about commercial games, because again, we can go down this rabbit hole, which I put here for your reference later. I should mention, for those who haven't done webinars with me before in the past, I like to weave a lot of data into my talks. I think it's useful to have it there in front of you to actually see the research, as opposed to just, like, say, media headlines. But it can get a little dense sometimes, kind of hard to keep it concise. So I try to sum it up, but then I'll leave it here if you'd like to read back into it later. But we found that gaming can actually be beneficial to both depression and anxiety, and that massively multiplayer online games, so where you're playing with large groups of people, are linked to positive social well-being, irrespective to how old the child is or how immersed in the world they are. And commercial games across most genres have been shown to be helpful to reduce stress in many circumstances. So again, and we'll talk about this again when we pivot here to social media use, but it's not what you're using. Oftentimes it's how you're using it. So you can use social media to maintain or expand existing friendships, because again, a tremendous amount of a teen's life these days is online. It's not really realistic to think of them not using it at all. Or if they did, they would have a tremendous case of FOMO, fear of missing out, because there is a lot that's going on there that they just wouldn't be able to participate in. They're also able to make new friends, particularly if they have similar interest groups. Right? So like if you're joining a Facebook group or a Discord channel or some sort of shared interest group, it allows you to connect. It also gives you this place semi-anonymously to explore yourself. Self-expression, competence, politics, personal sexual identity. It allows for them to express themselves, sometimes with a degree of anonymity that you don't get when you're face-to-face, which has value. So that brings me to the last part of our presentation today, which is what can we do? Because there are a lot of potential pitfalls. It's not to say, again, that everything is bad. It's not. Or that some amount can't be used relatively safely. It can. But the question is, how do we do it in a way that maximizes the benefits and that protects against the risks and the downsides as best as possible? And so that's what we'll talk about here for the last bit. So actionable steps you can take. So before we even get into anything tech specific, we got to talk about the relationship. You've got to be safe to talk to, including about difficulties and failures and things that are going wrong. Because if you are not viewed as an emotionally safe person to speak to, kids are not going to talk to you about what they're experiencing online, if, say, it's not in front of you, or anything else that's going on. And so the way to develop a relationship with emotional safety, if you don't already have one, is through communication. And there's a great acronym that was coined by the Center for Motivation and Change called Communicate with Love, which stands for listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. And we're gonna go through this now, because again, if you're thinking to yourself, man, like I'd love to try some strategies, but I don't even know if my kid would listen to me. And like they seem like totally uninterested in speaking to me, or we have an adversarial relationship. you got to go back to basics, right? Someone's got to be open to hearing you out or open to your influence for you to be able to guide them. And the way that you create that feeling of safety is not through like status, right? Not like I'm your parent, therefore I'm safe to talk to. Not how it works. You also can't make an intellectual argument. That does not work for feelings, because feelings, if you think back to that dog with the car, feelings come from our limbic system, right? That comes from the emotional side of our brain. That part where urges and feelings come from actually are not directly linked to language and logic. They're linked to experience. And so the way you get someone to trust you is not by saying, you can trust me. It's by being trustworthy and showing up and being trustworthy over and over and over again. And this is how you do it. This is how you show safety. So let's go through these quickly to give the structure. So listening means active listening. So using open-ended questions when you talk and reflecting meaning back. So what active listening means is that people don't know you're listening just by default. You have to show them that you are. One way you can do that is with your body. And you can see in this picture, the mother is leaning forward a little bit, making good eye contact. That's all helpful. But you can also use your words to show that you're listening. Reflections are when someone tells you something and then you say it back to them using different words. What that means, if you can take in their meaning and then say it back to them differently. Like say if your child gets into the car and this is just looking dejected and says, "Oh man, I got a C on my geometry test today." If you hear that and say something like, "Oh man, you must be so frustrated and sad. I know how hard you studied for that." What you're doing is you're taking in the emotional meaning of what they're saying, even though they didn't say it, they were emoting it, right? But you're giving that emotion back, giving words to it, and maybe even showing that you paid attention and you knew how much that they'd studied. That shows someone that they're seen and heard. You can also just repeat back the content level. It doesn't have to be emotions, right? So like if someone, say your son broke up with his girlfriend and he feels really sad about it and is saying like I feel so bad about it. And you were to respond by, "Oh man, like that's must be just absolutely crushing. I know you guys have been together for a long time." You didn't say the word crushing, but clearly that's what's happening. That's the sort of thing that helps people really feel heard. This, by the way, is how we therapists work all the time, right? That we use these types of reflections in order to help folks go more deeply into what they're talking about and for them to feel heard when they're speaking to us. An open-ended question means asking a question that doesn't have a quick yes or no answer. So this is the difference between a closed question, which would be like, say you're talking to your child and you say, "Did you have a good day at school today?" "Yeah." Closed. Open would be something like, "What was the most interesting thing that happened at school today?" Or "What's something that's challenging you at school right now?" That's open. And even just asking an open-ended question, even if your child doesn't take the bait, an answer shows that you care, particularly if you then follow that question up with some reflections, maybe some more open-ended questions. That's how you show someone that you're interested in them and that they've been seen. So that's listening. Offering is how do you offer feedback and guidance? And this is really critical because this is where a lot of times parents can get into this push and push back dynamic with their kids. And the key to this is that if you don't push, there's no way to be pushed back against. And the way you don't push is by offering guidance through a feedback sandwich. And what this means is you first start, before you just tell them what you think would be useful, is you ask permission to give advice. You say something literally like, "I've been through something like this before. Can I share what worked for me?" Or whatever fits the context. But by doing that, they're literally consenting to hearing your opinion. It's the opposite of pushing. They're saying, "Yes, I will hear it." And that's also very useful because there's a lot of parts of kids' lives that are not under their control, that they don't have control over. And so asking them if they'd like to hear what you have to say is one way that they can have a little bit of autonomy. That said, if they can't say no, like if you have to talk about something, don't ask, because the worst thing that you could do is ask, "Is this okay?" And they say no, and then you do it anyway. One way around that is you can, if they do say no, though, and you still have to talk to them, is you can say, "Okay, well, what would be a good time to chat? We have to talk about this sometime today. You tell me when it would be best for you." And that's still accomplishes the objective while giving them some sense of autonomy. But that's the first slice of bread in the sandwich, if you will. The meat is the advice. So then you, after they say yes, ideally you tell them your opinion about something. But then afterwards you ask for their reaction. You ask them how they feel about it. And you can even explicitly say it's okay to disagree. And what that does is it means that if they like the advice, which hopefully they do, not giving bad advice, is that they will have asked for it, you will have given it, and then they will have reflected on it and decided for themselves that they like it. And what we know from research is that they will be far more likely to actually give it a shot than if you just kind of like throw it on them. They're like, yeah, mom, yeah, dad, or whatever it is, and then just try to get out of the conversation and move on. Less effective. So give the feedback sandwich a try if you haven't done that before. The V stands for validating. So letting someone know that you can understand the emotional reason behind their actions, even if the actions themselves need to be changed, like if the behavior needs to be modified. Because again, a lot of times if we're talking about social media and tech and you have to have some hard conversations about this, there are reasons why they're doing it. And if you can validate the reasons, and that's totally understandable. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with their emotions. It's just that this particular way of meeting them is the problem. And we got to find a different way of meeting it that lands a bit better than if you're telling them that they're wrong, right? They're wrong for doing what they're doing, and that's the only focus. And the last part, E, is empathizing. To borrow a phrase here from Brene Brown, if someone's in a dark hole, they don't necessarily want to just be whisked out. That can actually feel disempowering sometimes to be just saved, if you will. What tends to work better is empathize. Show them that you understand. You've been there before. You feel what they feel. Get down in the hole with them, and then perhaps offer a feedback sandwich about an idea that they might be able to use to help get themselves out, right? So that's the love model: listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. If you haven't tried this, give it a go. It actually is useful for just about anybody, not just for kids. This is a great way of being open, of being genuine, and building that emotional safety. Now, that being said, if you don't have a relationship that is centered on emotional safety right now, it might take a little bit of time to get there. So have persistence and don't get discouraged. And remember, as you go along throughout this, again, all behaviors have a purpose. If, say, for example, your child is withholding, right? Like if they are not being open with you about how they feel, there is a reason for that. And it might have been something that they've learned over time, right? It's probably a self-protective mechanism. And so instead of getting frustrated, right, which is making it more perhaps about your feelings, right, and wanting to help or wanting to be able to influence because you care about them, if instead you can think, okay, so this is developed for a reason. How do I work with that? It'll get you a lot further. So you then want to promote the development of healthy coping behaviors. So physical health is a great place to start. Everything truly is harder if our bodies aren't right. I think most of us here tonight are probably parents. And so you've been through the infant stage, and you know that when you don't sleep, everything gets harder. And that is true. That is true for kids as well. I've got two of them of my own. I know what it's like. But exercise, nutrition also really matter. And these can be sometimes difficult to tweak, but other times lower hanging fruit in terms of healthy coping styles that can make a big difference if you start to move to weave them in a systematic way. Meditation and diaphragmatic breathing, also some of the most effective, easiest to start, transdiagnostic, useful for a lot of different problems, habits that you can get into. I don't think I have the slide in here about this, but the app I like most for teaching kids to meditate is Headspace. They actually have specific kid-friendly meditations in there, a lot of content, a lot of instructions, animations, really useful. There's also a book, I think it's called Teaching Mindfulness in 10 Minutes per Day for Teens. So I think what that's called. That's the book that I like a lot. You can also show them how to talk through their emotions and problems, which again is really useful and is one of the primary ways we do healthily cope with our emotions. It's by talking about them with people who we trust. So you can be that for them. And lastly, don't be afraid to work with a therapist. Like we don't bite. I think sometimes that it can be difficult sometimes to take that step. But honestly, if you see the trajectory of behaviors going in a negative direction, and it doesn't seem to be getting better, or you're starting to get worried, injecting a professional into the mix can sometimes make a huge difference. So don't shy away from that. We can really help. So now, in terms of social media specifically, on ways to do this in a healthy way, and I'm going to be mindful, we are about 5 minutes from the top of the hour. So we're going to try to get through these slides in about that much time, maybe a little bit over. And then if you have some questions, I'm happy to stay after to answer those. So feel free to stick around. Again, after I'm done talking as well, I'll pop on and stick some links in the chat to resources. I'll also email those out as well. So you want to focus with social media on opportunities that provide healthy social support, companionship, and emotional intimacy. So this means you got to pay attention to who they're talking to, what they're in, and sometimes make some tough choices. It might be popular, might not be healthy for them, in terms of who are they exposed to on certain apps? Are they ready, mature? Have you had conversations about social media literacy and where the dangers are? Just making sure you're very thoughtful about what they're exposed to. You want to make sure that they know that they should be minimizing social media use for social comparison, particularly related to physical appearance. Ideally, keep them away from apps that have toxic design features. That includes likes, which I know are in a lot of social media apps, but we got to be mindful of that because, again, that video that apparently steamrolled my audio and kept going over and over, that's what that was getting at, right? It can be very obsessive. The endless scrolling where there's no end to content, unrestricted time limits. You can actually set time limits on certain apps as well in certain digital devices so that you can have them shut down after a certain amount of time. Monitor children in early adolescence closely in particular and teach digital literacy. There's a lot to know. And I'll be sending out some resources that goes very deep into what's worth knowing at different ages. But there's a lot of different nuances, like what's private and what's not, what's stored, what do you share, are people taking screenshots of your content, what's safe to send, what's not safe to send, how do you manage certain stressful situations online. These are all things that kids don't know. And, much like you wouldn't just necessarily, turn a kid loose in public, even a teenager necessarily in situations without a chaperone. Like a phone without guardrails on it is literally like the whole world with all of its dangers and all of its influences right there in their hand. And there's people who are going to try to take advantage of them. And that's a whole nother topic that we could get into. But there's a lot of predators online. There's a lot of pitfalls, a lot of dangers. You want to make sure that you monitor communications, subscriptions, and posts, and ideally closely. If you've ever heard of Finstagram, right? It's a fake Instagram account. There's like an account that they want you to see, and then there's another one that they switch to when they think you're not looking that has the things that they don't want you to see. And so just making sure that you're really plugged in to what they're doing, which I know can be a struggle sometimes because kids want privacy, but it is our job as parents to protect them until they are 18 years of age. That is when they're no longer under our protection, and that just means that particularly when it comes to some of these very potentially dangerous influences on social media, whether or not it's sexual predators or even drugs. I mean, the majority of drug deals that aren't done in person, say like at school, happen on Instagram, happen on Snapchat, happen on social media. And you can have things just mailed to your house. Honestly, it's kind of the age that we're in right now. So we've got to pay attention. We've got to be careful. Some dynamics to watch out for. I'm going to start with a couple of don'ts, then switch to a few do's, and then we'll finish things off probably about 5 after the hour and take some questions. So you want to make sure that you don't cede control over a situation due to your own anxiety, because a lot of times, if I had to pick it's almost like an archetype. It's parents who have a teenager who gets very angry and angsty about being cut off from screens, and they throw temper tantrums, they throw fits, they might even get like violent or aggressive or menacing. And so the thought is almost like, I don't want to deal with this, so I'm just going to avoid it. And the problem is that allows not only the behavior to continue, but for them to think it's effective. A great phrase to think about is, what you permit, you promote. So if you are allowing your child to speak to you disrespectfully, to disregard you, to flaunt your rules, what you're teaching them is, one, that they can definitely do that with you to get what they want. And two, that might be what they think they can do with other authority figures in their life or how they treat family. And so if you're in that sort of cycle, it's very important to take that control back. And I know that can be tricky. Every family is different around this, but making sure that you don't cede control over the dynamics in your house to your children because of difficult situations or anxiety around them. Second thing you don't want to do is make it yourself versus the games, because that's a dynamic where if a child is seeing games as like their social outlet and their way of dealing with feelings, the last thing you want to do is create, it's almost like a love triangle, right? Where you're trying to like get in between them and their tech. And so the better way to go about it, if you can, is try to get in there with them, like play games with them, understand what they're doing. Show them that you care about them and their world, and that it's not just that you're, some stodgy mom and dad who don't get it or disconnected or just getting in their way, but that you really want to understand them and help them get what they want out of their life. Now, in terms of the do's, we want to focus on changing the reward value of oppositional behavior and screens. What reward value means is when if you have a child who's acting oppositionally, who's being angry and pushing you away, and they're doing it repetitively, that means that they feel like they're getting more out of that than working with you. Again, that the benefits outweigh the costs. And that's what we call reward value. And so you got to think about what can we do to lower the value of that in ways that they care about. And if if you just feel like you're punishing more and more and more, that might be a sign that there's something that you're missing. Not to say that there shouldn't be consequences for actions. You do need consistent boundaries and limits, but there might also be something else at play that can help shift that balance. Worth mentioning, the limits around screens might not always be about time. Sometimes it's about finishing rounds. Like there's some games, for example, where they're playing like a 20 or 30-minute round with friends. And so if you're stopping them, like if you say like 2 hours and then you're done, or 1 hour and then you're done, and they're like 3 minutes away from finishing a round, that can be a great way to create resentment and conflict. Whereas if it was like you're going to play 2 rounds or 4 rounds or 4 games or whatever it is, that might avoid some fights and conflict. You also want to make sure you're rewarding positive behavior rather than just punishing the behavior you don't want to see. Because again, we do things for a reason. All behavior has a purpose. And so if we want our child to repeat a certain behavior, they need to feel like they're getting something out of it. It can't just be like neutral or bad to work with you, right? Ideally, there has to be some benefit to it, or it's very difficult to compete with like opening those loot boxes or chatting with all your friends and having these shared experiences, or feeling powerful because you just beat some massive thing in a game. So you've got to try to speak that language of reward and behavioral shaping, because you can. Sometimes it just takes putting on a different lens. So as I mentioned before, you want to understand the why. You want to start by finding common ground with the games, or with the tech, with the social media. So is there a problem that you both can agree on, like sleep, or struggling with body image, or anxiety or depression? A lot of times you can look at that, find some common ground, and then work on how do we solve that problem. A technique that you can use as well is adding things in that will naturally take away from screen time rather than taking out screen time. So say, for example, your child can really identify with the fact that they're tired all the time, and say, okay, well, what if we shoot for like 7 hours of sleep a night and we work on that? That's adding in sleep. And yes, that might mean that they're stopping with their screen earlier, but the focus isn't on stopping earlier with the screen, it's on adding in sleep, which perhaps is a goal that they do care about. One very consistent recommendation amongst all sources that I found is to create a family media plan that everyone adheres to. So if, say, for example, there's no screens after a certain time, it should go for you too, even if it's tough. Or no screens at the dinner table, or if there's going to be a screen-free period where you connect as a family, making sure that it's something that goes for everybody. That there's not like rules for thee but not for me, like that sort of thing, right? Everyone goes along with it. Have access to phones and mobile devices, again, because it's really not safe not to. Make sure you're on the same page as your parenting partner, because inconsistency is a killer for this sort of thing. So really making sure you're on the same page if at all possible. And if you're in a partnership or a marriage, make sure you take care of yourself and that partnership or marriage, because as household leaders, you set the tone. And if you're fighting, or if your emotional health, if that's suffering, it flows down to the kids. They feel it, they soak it in. That's more they've got to cope with. So last model I'll give you, and then we'll talk about resources and finish up for the night. The American Academy of Pediatrics has a really easy, great model called the 5 C's of media use, in terms of ways to boil a lot of what we talked about today down to just 5 different areas all of which start with C. The first is communication. How can you talk about media to raise a smart and responsible child? So thinking about, are you talking about it? The second one is crowding out. What does media get in the way of? Socialization, sleep, etc. Third, how do they calm down emotions or go to sleep? So how are they coping? And is this interfering with their ability to lower that activation and achieve sleep? Fourth C is content. What is actually worth their attention? Sometimes if they really think about it, they'll realize, wow, like I'm spending all this time on TikTok and actually not getting anything out of it. I don't even remember what I watched 2 days later, right? That can be helpful as well. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, who is your child? How do they react to media? And what are their motivations for using it? And then speak to that. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more, some places to look that I recommend. Game Quitters is great for folks who are actually trying to just quit games if they feel that gaming's gotten out of control. Healthy Gamer is another great site that speaks to how do you balance health and gaming at the same time. Boston Children's Hospital has a digital wellness lab and a clinic specifically for tech issues, whether or not social media, screens generally, or gaming. Lots of great resources on their website. There is a great book about how to talk to your kids about social media and other concerns called The School of Hard Talks. I strongly recommend this book. I also did a podcast with Dr. Michael Rich, who recently came out with a book, here I'll take my head out of the way, called The Mediatrician's Guide, which is really driving into exactly what we talked about tonight. So if you're interested in more on this topic, you can check out my podcast. I'll put the link in the chat when we're done. I'll email it out as well later. But this book is just a treasure trove of information. So summing everything up for the evening, past 4 years, if we go way back to where we started today, past 4 years have been very hard on teens emotionally, and they're trying to find effective methods to cope. Social media, gaming, and tech have been designed to have this broad appeal, and they foster these addictive-like behavioral patterns. Interactive media can be helpful for emotional health, but it can also devolve into disordered behavior, particularly for at-risk teens who say already have anxiety, depression, body image problems. So how interactive media is used is just as important as what is being used, and that is really critical. We have to understand the why, and armed with that, how do we use it and why are we using it? We can leverage family dynamics to shape behavior, promote healthy choices around gaming, social media, and tech. So with that, a couple last hot pieces of housekeeping here. Feel free to hop back on. We'll be doing these actually pretty much every Monday for the month here of June and going into July. And so we've got webinars coming up. I created this series because of problems that I was hearing from the parents that I work with. I do a lot of work with schools, health departments, and these were the topics that were coming up the most. So if any of these are interesting to you, please, you can scan the QR code. I'll put again the link in the chat, but please feel free to join. On July 29th, also, I'll be doing an extended 90-minute Q&A. So if you have any other questions or just want to chat, we'll be doing that one more in meeting format unless it's way too large for it, to just be able to interact a little bit more and have a discussion. So please feel free to sign up. Hope you'll join me. And lastly, just want to say thank you for your time tonight. Really appreciate it. I know these are concerning issues, but it's also, there's so many things vying for your time. I appreciate spending some of it with you. If you'd like to get in touch, you can reach out to me again via my email or website, find me on social media, and if you would be so kind, I've got a brief feedback form, and I'll put the link in the chat very shortly as well, or you're welcome to scan that QR code. I'll also put in the email. I'd love to hear about whether or not this webinar was useful, what you'd like to change, what you liked and what you didn't.